Welcome to Live at Kigali, the battle for the future of work. I am Terri Chapman. I'm the co-chair of the Kigali Global Dialogue, and I am joined by Christabel, Senior Social Protection Specialist at the World Bank, and by Khalila Mbowe, who is the country director for Girl Effect and CEO of Unleash Africa Social Ventures. So today we're talking about the challenges of the future of work. So Christabel, I'm turning to you first. When we think about the future of work, we often think about digital transformations, we think about the gig economy, and kind of the implications of these two things on how people work, where they work, and how they're able to, and sort of the implications for social protections. But can we apply a similar kind of logic to the future of work, how we're thinking about the future of work in the context of climate change? How would a climate change, or how would a climate lens, should I say, change sort of the way that we think about the future of work? So for example, how are extreme heat and weather events impacting the same kinds of dynamics, how people work, where they work, if they're able to, and if they're able to access social protections?
Thank you so much, Terry. And I think that's a really interesting question and a good one that we should deliberate on, because the future of work requires a holistic discussion, a holistic policy approach, a holistic approach to engage the issues, to ensure that everybody can tap into the future of work. And it's the same thing for climate change. So for example, at the World Bank now, in every project that we're doing, we have to show how we're addressing climate adaptation and climate mitigation. It doesn't matter if it's not only for like an energy project anymore. It doesn't matter if it's social protection, if it's education, if it's health, you have to look within that lens. And I think that feeds kind of into the question that you're asking, which is that, when we're looking at climate change, we're looking at the positive parts of it, I think, with a jobs lens is the introduction of the discussion of green jobs and the opportunities within recycling, afforestation, and all of these, right? But there's positive aspects of it, similar to the positive aspects of future of work through digitization, right? There's an opportunity for us to do some of the same things that we're doing, but do it in a better space where we're also saving our world in the process. So it can be a win-win, right? So if you're working within, say, the recycling value chain, there are opportunities for you to be innovative, removing aspects of negativity, so to speak, but still being able to have a fulfilling job. But the question I ask, and I think it comes from the lens of being a social protection expert, is, are we looking at this inclusively, right? So when we think of the climate change agenda, are we thinking of the poorest and the most vulnerable? What are the areas that we can look to so that they can also benefit from within the agenda? I know a lot of people think about, say, clean energy stoves as an example, to provide to poor and vulnerable. And I think the positives there is that it helps them be able to access more healthy ways of doing the same thing that they do, which is great. But what are we thinking to the last mile for people in that area on climate change, who usually are the ones who are not contributing as much to the negative aspects of it, right? So how can we change the discussion to say, as there rains and more floods, evidently, and research demonstrates that the poor and the vulnerable suffer the most in these changes. If you take a map of Ghana, for example, we've done some work there, you will see that where the highest floods are occurring, and also I think we saw it also in the droughts side of things, the most poor and vulnerable are located. So how can we be more policy oriented to be inclusive of such people would be the response. And we could pick examples from so many different places, but I'll stop here.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you for that. I think, it is critical to give that lens because there's so many aspects of climate change, right, that are shaping our world, that are putting workers in all kinds of vulnerable situations. And we don't tend to think about the future of work in that way. And that is something we have to start shifting. And I like the point that you made that, maybe there's also opportunities, or there definitely are opportunities in the green transition. How do we create jobs and even decent, fulfilling, high income jobs that also are fulfilling and interesting? And so, we have to see the opportunities, especially for the most vulnerable, and leverage what we can and also mitigate the risks for so many workers. So Khalila, kind of on that point, I'm going to turn to you. So, when we talk about jobs, when we talk about work, we talk about incomes. We talk about social protections because for so many workers, the way that they access the most basic social protections is often through work, right? Health insurance, unemployment insurance, those kinds of things. And of course, there's a huge swath of workers who are informal who don't get any of those things through work. Let's not pretend that's not the case, right? But when we think about work, those are kind of the aspects that we think about as benefits. But one of the things that I find to be a huge gap in the way that we think about work is this kind of gap in fulfillment. Work can be a hugely fulfilling part of life, and we tend to think, or we tend to say that, less advantaged segments of the population should be going into these, jobs that are kind of, they give them an income, maybe they give them social protections, but that's it. They're not fulfilling at all. They are not inspiring. It is just monotonous kind of work. So how can we think about a sort of kind of fulfillment gap in work? Is that something that we should be thinking about? How can we think about it? I know you have done, you've talked about this a lot, so tell us your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Terri. So first question, exactly what you posed. Why jobs? Why do we work in the first place, right? So on one aspect, we want to earn a living. Yeah, everything you need to transact, and what you're transacting is what you receive from a job, which is money. On the flip side is fulfillment, purpose, a sense of being, a sense of well-being, being able to wake up in the morning and know you're contributing to something and go to sleep knowing that my life counted for something. Now, this is not a luxury that everybody is afforded. This is literally a luxury, right? And that's because the way the world has been created, how we have structured the workspace as a whole has not facilitated this at all. The workspace has been created to create these routine jobs where we have people going into a 9-to-5, forget your sense of fulfillment and your mental health and your well-being, right? There are KPIs you have to accomplish, and this is basically the life you're subscribed to. So when we start talking about decent work, right, it's not necessarily just work. When I think about decent work, it's not just necessarily just work that provides let me just call it a positive work environment, but it's also something that can allow a person to know that they've added to something. Now, we're in this time, in this juncture in global history, what's going to be talked about as history, where we can now create a completely different way to look at things. And with the youth that are coming up right now, people are talking about sense of fulfillment. I'm looking for a space where I can get fulfilled, where I can contribute to purpose. Millennials and the Gen Z, that's what the people are looking at. And we can talk about the informal, this is largely pertinent in the formal sector, but also in the informal sector. And I work with a lot of startups in the country, and we work a lot with young girls, and some of the questions are, I want to do something that allows me to add value. I want to do something that allows me to find out more about myself. I want to be able to contribute. Now, the spaces that we have right now do not add to this, but what the pandemic did, it created this even playing field where now we're forced to start thinking about, okay, so how do we start creating these spaces? Now, as we're thinking about creating these spaces, some of the questions that I think we have to think about as, I don't want to say as employers, but as a whole, is how do we make the world a better place? Because first and foremost, the workspaces that we have do not largely answer these questions. It's about the bottom line, and the bottom line is the dollar value, right? But how do we make the world a better place? How do we create workspaces that add value rather than take away from the world? Because that's the go-to right now, right? Add value rather than take. How can we be at the helm of change? How can we be contributors, right? And I fully believe that if all workspaces and leadership starts thinking in this way, then we are creating workspaces that allow. I shy away from using the word employees, right? Because I feel that every one of us, we're partners in a shared vision. And that's how we should start thinking about it, rather than this employer-employee dynamic, which largely now creates this separation and demarcation that doesn't do well in building workspaces that reinforce purpose, right? But when it comes to now, how do we now get into that space? It's a total mindset shift. It's a total mindset shift that has to involve the collective. We have to go back to basics. We have to think about creating for the people, right? Creating for the people. And largely, we don't think about that. Creating for the people, now we have to think about it from education. How do we build democracy infrastructures, healthcare, and so on and so forth? And these are all different spaces, right? But young people, you go into school, what are you told? And I'm Tanzanian, and I'll go at it from there. You go to work so that you go to school so that you get a job. Yep. You're getting a job so that you, and that's thinking that's ingrained in young people or in people since you're a child, and you grow up with that thinking pattern. So even when you become the employer, you are expecting some sort of from your employee, because that's what we have framed society to think. That's the way we've framed society to think. So then, even as parents, how do we create this conversation that it can trickle down to the family setting and say, well, what are the skills your child has? What does fulfillment look like for them? What does fulfillment look like for you as a parent? And how do we have that conversation seep through all these different aspects of society? And I think the space that we start at is having these conversations and making sure that these conversations do not end at KGD, the Kigali Global Dialogue, but we take it back to our workspaces where employers now can start asking the employees, what does fulfillment look like for you? What is purpose? And these are courageous conversations that need to be had. And more so because we normally don't like the answers that will come back, right? we don't like that. But then we have to have this courageous conversation so that we can collectively create a world that now changes not only what the workplace looks like, but how the world functions as a whole.
Thank you. Yeah, that was really interesting. And I think you're right. These are absolutely the conversations that we need to have and take them back to our offices, take them back to our schools, take them back to our families, and actually have these uncomfortable and sort of difficult conversations to rethink sort of these dynamics exactly that you're describing. And I want to pick up one more point that you talked, and I'll point this one to you, Christabel. So the pandemic has clearly sort of reshaped the employer-employee dynamic. And this is definitely kind of what I'm going to say is more targeted towards a certain segment of the workforce, the more advantaged, the ones in the high-income countries. But, you know, the pandemic has, a lot of these workers were able to work from home, right? And that sort of provided an opportunity to rethink that employer-employee relationship. And a lot of people have sort of started to rethink, like, is this really what I want to do? Do I really want to be in the office? How much of myself, my time, my being does the employer own? You know, how much of that, of myself, do they have? And those are conversations or kind of dynamics that people are starting to rethink, I think. At least I know for sure I am. But Christabel, I mean, how does that conversation, how is that sort of playing out in your work and the things that you're seeing? Because that is a very kind of Western conversation that's happening, you know, among the workers who had the possibility of working from home, but not for all workers, obviously. And so how do we kind of rethink the employer-employee relationship in a productive way, in a way that increases inclusivity for all workers?
Great. It's a great question. I think a nice segue from Khalila's discussion on fulfillment and the fact that it's a luxury. I think that's where we start from. And you phrased it well to say these are typically high income or Western developed country discussions. I call them first world problems, which is fine, right? Because a lot of the times when you know, such strife comes, it's an opportunity for us to rethink what we do. When there was a point in the pandemic where across the globe, most people knew somebody that had died, you had no choice than to ask yourself, what does life mean to you? And I believe this was something that happened quite a bit across the world, really. So it gave us an opportunity to think of our future, which we don't own, right? So if you don't own your future, what do you want to do with the parts that you can hold on to? I used lockdown to start exercising. I'm a lazy exercise person. I swim now and then and call it a day. But I did it, one, because I understood the health implications of it, but two, also because I needed to fill time and not go crazy, right? So what did that do? It created an exercise mindset in me moving forward, right? And I think that's what happened quite a bit, is people started picking different things outside of the job itself. And I don't negate the fact that I actually worked more in my life than I ever had because of the job I had, where we had to give government quick money to help the poor and the vulnerable and to respond to the health crisis, right? So we actually found ourselves working 16-hour, 17-hour days every day. But because of that, I decided I'll wake up and use the first 2 hours to find me time so I don't go crazy, literally. And I found that a lot of colleagues had this same situation. We were fortunate enough to have the infrastructure to work from home, because infrastructure is key. If you live in Ghana, where, for example, the power or electricity is not necessarily as reliable as it should be. You can be on a video call and be cutting every, other day, or you can be on the most important interview and then it goes off. So you need a generator or a solar system. All of this infrastructure is not something that everybody can have, right? So even though I think the pandemic did teach us that we're all equal, there was still equal and equal, right? So how do we look at that aspect of things? So a discussion comes up, and we were talking about this earlier, where I have the opportunity of working in a global institution, and the discussions of working from home prolongedly are different in Washington, D.C. than they are in Arusha, Tanzania, or Accra, Ghana, and other places, because we had, one, shorter lockdowns, and on hindsight, I think our governments actually would probably have done something different. Everybody was locking down, and you didn't want to take the chance of not doing it and then facing the consequences, so everybody did it. But we locked down 3 weeks and 2 weeks and maybe a month, and then maybe there were curfews. It wasn't the same dynamic as it was, for example, in the United States or in Europe, right? Why? Because we have majority informality in our workspace. So when we're talking about fulfilling work, what does it mean to the informal setting? When we're talking about changing the dynamics of what is important to us as an employee, what does it mean to somebody living in the US versus somebody living in Ghana? And I think it's important that we're able to have those quote unquote localized discussions and then have the universal discussion, so that right now we've proven, and in the pandemic, I've said, and I've actually written about it, I thought it was a blessing in disguise for the continent, because we started quickly doing things. In Ghana, for example, we were using drones to send blood to people, right? We picked up the digitization agenda that had been discussed, but we championed it and actually implemented it, and you find this in other parts of the continent. So there's these positive aspects of the new type of work that we need to keep doing. So if we've now learned to work from home for the most part, why are we going back? That's the question, right? I think it's a fine balance. I won't lie, I'm one that loves people. I needed some hugs. I needed to see people and laugh and have those conversations, on the balcony and such. But at the same time, I also know people who simply could not be at home because, for example, their kids were home, for a prolonged period, and somebody had to supervise them. What did that mean? There's also the aspect where working from home increases a toll on the employee, right? Electricity, for example, starts going up, what you would have used in the office. So there's so many dynamics that we could take a look at this and ask ourselves, what do we want to do differently? I was reading something from McKinsey that said it's not necessarily a new normal, but it's the next normal, because it will keep evolving, right? So what do we do with this next normal? I think is finding a middle ground, right? Where the things that were positive, quote unquote, during the pandemic that kind of leapfrogged us on the continent, for example, in adapting digitization, how do we pick on that and keep going, right? Such that we can say, and I think it's going to have to be different depending on where you're working, because if you're a farmer, you still need to go farm. But we can pick on the technologies to make farming easier and more fulfilling, with coming back to the climate change issues with extreme heat, right? So that if we adapt some of the digital technologies that are in place, we adopt them, we would be able to make it easier for a woman farmer to be more fulfilled, right? So I think across board, we need to look at it and find that fine line. But where I agree with you fully is we can run away from this employer-employee relationship to see it as, a win-win situation for both angles, and not be too extreme on either way. Because I also know people who worked from home and didn't like it at all, right? So we can't necessarily say the answer is one direction. I think we're having the opportunity to open up discussions such that we find that middle ground and be more flexible, right? And within the discussion around future of work, and I'll end with this, that fits into the whole idea of flexibility. A lot of people talk about entrepreneurship as a new normal, so to speak. I kind of go backwards a little bit on it, because I also know a lot of people, including myself, who are actually, I prefer being an employee, right, to being an entrepreneur. but I need an entrepreneurial mindset to evolve, to be innovative in what I do. So those are the discussions that we need to have, and we need to also have that discussion where being an entrepreneur without an ecosystem that helps you thrive is not going to work. So we've really gotten an opportunity to rethink what a job is, what an access to employment opportunities is, because I think those two are different, and how we pick on it as we move forward.
Thank you so much. Yeah. I mean, I think you're absolutely right in terms of needing to find a middle ground. I don't think we can go on the extreme either way. And I do think, as you said, there are so many opportunities for kind of leveraging the advancements that did occur, the disruptions that happened during the pandemic, to sort of start to rethink and take some of those innovations and changes and try to sort of find the best possible, solutions building on those. And I think you're right, the employer-employee relationship, we have to rethink that. And for me, it always comes back to social protections. In my experience, I can't stand the fact that we love this model where your basic social protections are somehow available through a job, and when you lose your job, you lose your access to healthcare, you lose access to things that you fundamentally need. And for me, that's one of the most problematic things about that relationship that I can't stand. And it also, of course, means that informal workers just don't have access to them. So we have to get that to the individual. Now, Khalila, I know that we don't have a ton of time, but I want to bring in the gender discussion. I want to, know some of your thoughts on how the pandemic has disrupted work, especially, and sort of the impacts and implications for women, especially, and sort of the gender aspects of that.
Well, you talked about the fact that we were at home, somebody had to supervise the kids, and more so it was a mother.
Yes.
It was a mother. And so you had to juggle children, you had to juggle their education, you had to juggle your job, and of course right now, during the pandemic, the responsibilities that you had were heightened, right? You had to juggle your mental health and emotional well-being, and you had to figure out how to navigate this entire space, more so for women leaders. And nobody understands the kind of dynamics that you have to deal with on a daily basis, right? And so one of the things that I do believe happened, right? Yes, it gave us a great opportunity to work from homes because we were closer to our loved ones. But at the same time, it presented a lot of spaces that we had to think through and to start shifting our perspectives and how we relate to our work, right? And I do know a lot of women went through that shift. But the thing is, our current workspaces do not necessarily give the conducive environment for you to navigate those feelings, those emotions, and those thought processes, because you still have to function in a certain structure that was there. But one of the things that had happened, and I have to mention this, in many workspaces that had women in leadership, one of the things that we see, and there was also research by McKinsey and leaning.org, I think, that also looked into this. One of the things that came out was a lot of workspaces with women leaders actually fared a lot better because they were able to lead in with empathy and try to figure out, okay, so how do we build better for not just the women, but also the entire workforce, so that we can be agile in creating the different approaches that allow people to, navigate mentally and emotionally in this time frame. Unfortunately, our workspaces currently do not consider those success indicators, right? Not at all. And so you find that their contribution is largely unrecognized. But that is exactly what we need when we're talking about future of work. When we talk about inclusion, equity, diversity, that's the kind of soft thinking that we need to really build the future of work. So again, I'd go back to my former point. We need a lot of courage, not just from employers, but for even women who are entering the workforce to start asking for this. We have to vocalize and say, well, these are the things that we're looking for. Because, before, one of the things, it was when you go into a workspace and you want to claim that a lot of women, in the research that we did, when you have 3 kids, you'll write that you have 1. When you're expecting, you'll probably say, I don't want to have children, because it's looked at as a disadvantage. But why? Right? Now, those are the questions that we need to be asking. And this is not just the responsibility for the employer, because we keep talking about how workspaces have to create conducive work environments. No, we also have to start demanding for those things, right? And because at the end of the day, it's choices. And the great thing I love about these conversations that we're having right now is what we're doing is we're triggering people to change their perspectives about the choices that they have. You have the ability to make a choice, but to get to that space, we have to start with conversations that can actually trigger the thinking that actually make this making that choice a possibility. Does that make sense, right? So in some ways, we took several steps back. In some ways, we took steps forward. But at the end of the day, it's really about finding the balance and being able to have the courage to vocalize what we need. But even before vocalizing, we have to discover and identify what we need and be very clear and succinct about what that is, especially for the woman. We need to be able to be courageous about daring to figure out what that is, because that's the conversation that I feel we are not having. What exactly do you need to thrive? Right? And for me, that is exactly what will get to this. Gender parity is not one. Gender parity is building a workspace that allows people to thrive. What does that look like for the woman in the workspace when we're talking about future of work? Both informal and informally, right? A lot more questions than answers, but I think those are the trigger questions that we need to start thinking about.
That's how it goes. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think, yeah, it leads us to many questions that we do need to ask now, and this is the opportunity to ask them. So there are so many more aspects of this question that we could be discussing, and I would love to discuss them with you. I'm going to leave it there for the audience, unless either of you have any final comments that you want to make on how you're thinking about the future of work and how you plan to kind of take forward these questions in your lives.
If I may just pick up on what Khalila said at the very end, which was we should be able to demand. I would like to add the fact that we should also be able to have a safe space to know that we have other people who, have the empathy for us to do that, because it's not that easy to actually, you think about it, and it's like, though, you're going for a job interview as a woman, and they'll say, okay, you're going to earn $50,000, and you're like, okay, right? And a man will come and immediately say, nope, but that is how, in a lot of ways, it's been set up culturally, the mindset. So the mindset needs to shift, but mentoring is key, that we have role model women, leaders who will look out for those who are coming in and tell them, look, I'm going to hold your hand and I'm going to open the door for you. Because in a lot of ways, for most of us, it's the door being opened. Once we walk in, we prove ourselves. So more of us women in this discussion around the future of work should take that daring option, but also open the door for the next person.
Yeah, absolutely. And that links to what Khalila said before, right, about the companies or the organizations, the institutions that were led by women, right, that had a different experience throughout. And it is, you do have to lift people up, and they have to be intentional about doing that. And I can think of, 3 or 4 key women in my life who have opened the door for me. And I will always remember those. And as I move into more leadership positions, those are the kinds of things that I, hope to do for other women, because it is those key people, right? Khalila, any last thoughts?
We need to be able to take on innovation at a different stead. And I'm talking about innovation, not necessarily like whenever you say innovation, people think technology. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about thinking innovatively about what the future of our world looks like. The workspace is a small component of the globe, right? And at the end of the day, what we're doing is we're building products, program, what have you, that serve humanity, right? What does service to humanity look like when you're talking about the future of work? How do we individually look at our contribution as a people, and then how does that add up to the collective? Because I do believe the workspace needs to serve something. We need to think about contribution. And I normally love to use this phrase, how can you make sure that we are on the right side of history? What does that look like when we're talking about the future of work? The future of work is not just digital. The future of work is more mental, about how we are creating a world that serves humanity for the sustainability of our globe. So then that touches on so many different aspects. Then we can go into healthcare, into education, and so on, into climate change, and so on and so forth. But it just starts from that willingness to want to start thinking about service. What does service look like? What does my contribution look like? And that's where we must all start from, and that's where we build from as a whole.
Christabel, Khalila, thank you so much. Thank you to our audience for joining us at Live at Kigali. We hope to see you again at some of our other platforms. Thank you.